Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we'd like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy and Analytics, DAWEX, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Wakira, Pylog, Qlik, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you.
Qlik. He also provides thought leadership in modern data architecture, data governance, data literacy, and serves as an evangelist at major conferences and events just like this. Prior to Qlik, Joe was Vice President of Enterprise Information Management Technologies at TD Bank Group. And prior to that, he led a big data consulting practice at EMC. So this session will outline how modern data discovery and catalog techniques can be used to shift data governance further in the data funnel and how these techniques can be applied. So there we go.
Well, thanks so much. This is Joe. I'm thrilled to be with you. I am a little bit bummed not to be with you in person. I'm sure we all are. I'm speaking to you about 5 miles from the MIT campus where I live outside of Boston. So I always look forward to this conference, and this time everyone didn't come into my hometown to play with us. So I'm sorry about that. And as you can see, I'm suffering from a little bit of the coronavirus haircut. Those of you who have seen me before might know that I keep it high and tight, generally speaking. But, we'll see how this virus has some good side effects for my hair. We'll see how it all works out. So anyway, today what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about how I am experiencing the Chief Data Officer role and what is changing with respect to the Chief Data Officer role. And I think there's a lot of literature out there of what's happening. So I wanted to share some of those thoughts with you. So I became Chief Data Officer at Qlik in January of this year. And the first thing I wanted to do was to know what was happening out there, what kinds of things were happening in the marketplace, and how could I make myself smart about new techniques and new strategies and what was trendy. And I stumbled across an article that really seemed to speak to me. It was from Amr Inam in December of last year. And the quote is, CDOs must evolve their roles from defensive data strategy to offensive data strategy. Embrace their roles as change agents and take charge for driving value in organizations. That's the recipe for success. So this theme about being an offensive player really started to stand out in a lot of the literature. And I think that what people mean by that is we need to stop thinking so much in terms of the command and control types of governance that CDOs have been known for historically, and start to embrace a lot of the analytical outcomes that we're trying to see through with the business too. And so my technical title is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer, and we're starting to see that as a trend in a lot of organizations. It's not always useful to have just the cost equation and the control equation. Let's try and see if we can go out and drive some value. So I tried to wrap my arms around this concept of offensive and defensive strategy. And I came up with these kinds of concepts, and maybe this will resonate for you in terms of the work that you've done before. So I think of this idea of a classic defensive strategy being really about, okay, I have this data. Where did it come from? Can I rely on it? Prove that it's right. So if you think about, I come from a banking background. If you're in a banking organization, you need to wait for the regulators to come and say, prove it. If you are bound by Sarbanes-Oxley, you need to prove custody of data. And there's this idea of accuracy, trust, truth that is implicit upon what this data means. So I call this right to left thinking, because if you think about a data supply chain and data moving left to right, after the data gets back to the right, you say, where did this come from? How do I know that it's trustworthy? What controls went in place with respect to how it was transformed, et cetera? So if we think about the governance principles that are at play there, we think about lineage, we think about custody of data and who had access to those data over time from a security point of view, and we think about data quality. And I think that these are classic defensive strategies. They keep people out of jail. And my impression is that no one's ever had a successful career in data management after they've been to jail. That's not really a place where we want to spend time. So this is useful, but what does it mean to be offensively related? And I think that this idea has to do with a new concept that is fundamentally about the idea of left to right. This is data. What are we going to do with it? How do we start to contemplate value drivers that can be made available? You see CDOs that are responsible for data monetization plays, for data internal analytics plays. And I think that this is a real interesting moment where we're trying to think about data in its inherent value. There's a lot of research that suggests that we use only a very small percentage of the data that is available to us. So there was an article in the Harvard Business Journal, the MIT Technical Journal, that was authored by Antonio Regoletto, who says that data is doubling every 2 years, but it is only used at 0.5% of what we can see. So people only use 0.5% of what's created. It's a really fascinating metric if you think about it. Companies like Fitbit and Facebook exist to have all of this data. It keeps multiplying and gets all of this available to you, and then no one's using it. Well, this is the time where the CDO needs to start to think about how we're going to use that data. How can we actually start to make some insights? How do we capture business moments that need to be changed and influence that end result by analytics? So this is more left to right thinking. And there's a different set of technologies that I think are going to be embraced in this part of the universe, which is, if I'm going to be able to unleash the power of data, I need to be able to fundamentally find it and access it securely. So now all of a sudden I need different kinds of tools. I need discovery and metadata tag tools, things that automate the process of me helping to know that this is, a tax ID and you can't have it, or that this is a credit card number and you can't have it, and different things like that. Control of access, control of obfuscation rules, control of all these different things about who can have access to what. And at the same time, embracing this idea of a marketplace where we really want to just get our hands on data very quickly. So the idea there is we want to impose some kind of degree of control, but also some kind of idea of access at the same time through a catalog. And the metaphor that I often use in this context is, imagine your last trip into a pharmacy. And imagine that you were looking for some shampoo. You might say to the clerk, "Excuse me, can you direct me to the shampoo?" And they'd say, "Yes, of course, you can find that now too." You say, thank you, miss, that's great help. Can you tell me where the OxyContin is?" I think you'd get a funny look. I think that you'd know that there was a restriction there. There's a marketplace, but that marketplace has some controls in there. So how do we make sure that that works? How do we make sure that we have a thriving marketplace of data that can be used to drive next generation analytics, and also be done in an ethical kind of way? So we need to think through security. And I think that if you haven't heard about the concept of ethical AI today, you will over the course of this conference. As the complexity of analytics goes up, so too must be our understanding of how to use that data in an ethical kind of way beyond legal matters. And I was just listening to a podcast the other day around kind of the changing nature of how Facebook is embracing their responsibilities with respect to the ethics of data. And I think this is going to be something that's going to take us all by storm as these data decisions are made. So this is left to right thinking. This is, how do I unleash data? How do I connect the business outcomes of people that are there? So this is great. And the question on the table is, well, how do I balance this? How do I choose one over the other? Now, there was a model here that was put out by Dallemule and Davenport. And Davenport is another Boston local person who's a frequenter of this conference. And there's a great model that I like here, that it's about, if you're playing offense and defense, a lot of that has to do with how your industry perceives risk. How regulated are you? How tight are the controls around the data that you have access to? So if I think, for instance, about hospitals, hospitals are highly regulated. We have careful control over patient data, HIPAA regulations, and you typically see people really looking at more defensive things that are about protection of patient data. Banks are similarly controlled by certain things like Basel restrictions, et cetera, but you can start to see that they have a little bit more aggression in the marketing space, the ability to recognize certain buying behaviors that might be an indication, for instance, of someone buying a house or someone taking out a new insurance policy. Where you really see all the innovation, not surprisingly, is in the retail business. So if you think about all the greatest examples we have of real-time decision-making, it's Amazon, it's It's Netflix. It's these ideas of companies that are unencumbered by a lot of heavy-handed regulation that can make next best offers. And I think, the most notorious data story in analytics is about the Target's ability to predict teenagers' pregnancy. It wasn't about teenagers, it was about pregnancy, because understanding the moment that someone's about to change their buying behavior is really significant to the future buying behavior that they're going to have, and you want to capture that moment. So I'm in a software company, and I don't fit any of these categories. And so I started to think about this model a little bit differently. I think that, of course, we want to be bound by regulation. Of course, we want to experience what we have to do to control our data. I started to embrace a slightly different model that I'd like to share with you. Many of you might recognize this person. I'm tying back again to my Boston roots here. This is Patrice Bergeron. Patrice Bergeron is a center for the Boston Bruins, and he is holding in his hand the Selke Trophy. The Selke Trophy is awarded to the player who plays on an offensive line in the NHL, who is the best two-way player, meaning that this is a player who, when he's on the ice, their team scores and the other team doesn't score. And this, in hockey, for people that aren't big hockey fans, is measured by a metric that I just think is a really cool one called the plus minus. And someone who has a plus rating means more goals got scored when he was on the ice than he wasn't there. So many of you might be familiar with a guy by the name of Ovechkin, Alexander Ovechkin. He scores a lot. He was the leading goal scorer 2 years ago, and he had a minus goal, plus minus, meaning he scored a lot, but didn't matter because everyone was scoring when he was on the ice because he didn't play any defense. So I love this metaphor. And by the way, it's good for a hometown Boston crowd here. The idea here, Patrice Bergeron, by the way, has won this trophy, the Selke Trophy, 4 times, more than any other player. And he's in the top 4 all time in plus minus. So he's my hero. And the idea here is that there's a nice metaphor of here. What I want to do is I want to be on the ice, metaphorically, when we score analytically, when we make breakthroughs, and at the same time, I need to prevent those goals from being scored against us. I need to prevent security breaches. I need to prevent the ability for us to disclose PII data. And both of those are equally important, and you're managing those with the same set of resources. So this is my new mantra, to own the plus minus. And I think that this is going to be an emerging thing that CDOs think about. How do I make sure that we are simultaneously in a protective mode of our own goal and in an offensive mode thinking about how we're going to score? And this requires a great deal of creativity. So let's talk a little bit about how we balance those things. So this is nice. This is all theory so far. So we're going to try and balance offense and defense. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of that, if we shall. So I've come to understand that as we develop data, we should best think about this data in the shape of a funnel. And data comes in and it's raw and often kind of gobbledygook data from transactional systems or web blogs. And then there is usually a curation process that gets this data available for use for people that need it to be curated for their own use. So there was a time when we were talking about classic BI, where you would spend time with a warehouse and you would carefully ask for something, what they wanted from the bottom of this funnel. And then you would take 6 months to carefully design the transformations that were required for that, build a data warehouse, build a visualization, and 1 year later provide a visualization that wasn't quite exactly what the business person had in mind. And that is frustrating for everybody. It's frustrating when it takes a long time. And at the end of the day, you feel very caged in by this idea of what you know and don't know. So what I'd like to do is to kind of introduce you to some analytics personas that I think are changing this. This business person still exists. This business person just wants, at the end of the day, the dashboard with their KPIs. They want to know if revenue is going up or down. They want to know if headcount is going up or down. And these things are often descriptive types of metrics, and they're things that fit carefully on a dashboard. This person operates at the bottom of the funnel. In the middle of the funnel, there is the type of person that is a data analyst. What they often want to do is they are capable of assembling data, but they could really benefit from some curation. For instance, I'd like to bind all of the data from system A and system B. I'd like to know which sales are correlated to someone visiting my website. Oh, unfortunately, the timestamp in system A is month, month, day, day, and the timestamp in system B is day, day, month, month, year, 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 year. Oh, now I have to clean up that data. And born is this whole concept of data wrangling and data engineering, and it's a real pain in the neck. And it really saps the productivity of this business analyst. The business analyst at the end of the day just wants the data to try and bind it together for some good. You want to be able to give them data that is somewhat curated, this kind of idea of fit for purpose data, so they can bind things together quickly. Wouldn't it be great, for instance, if I just had a table full of sales and a table full of customers, and I could bind them on demand and slice them and dice them? That would be great. And so this idea of this person operating in the middle of the funnel is an important one. And then, of course, as we try to get to the top of the funnel, this is where the data scientist lives. I used to work with a colleague, Dave Reiner, who used to quip that in analytics, chaff is the new wheat. Things that we used to throw away on the cutting room floor are the things that are the most useful and insightful in predictive modeling these days. You know, down at the bottom of the funnel, you're finding things out that people already know. Up at the top of the funnel is really where you're really starting to play offense. So these people crave raw data. They're looking for anomalous behaviors. They're looking for potentially fraud, which is reliant on raw data. So what do those keystrokes look like and how are they anomalous? They're looking for certain behavioral patterns in raw behavior on websites and traffic in that kind of way. So up towards the top of the funnel, there's a lot more expectation that you have more skill and more patience to get through that data in exchange for the fact that that data might not really be all that important. One of my colleagues, Bill Schmarzo, always uses the word mightily. He says, up at the top of the funnel, we specialize in data that might be important. Think about that for 1 second and how profound that is. Down at the bottom of the funnel, you deal with data that is important. That executive knows that they want that headcount report, that revenue report. It's repeatable and it happens all the time. At the top of the funnel, we don't have that kind of certainty. We're looking for things that might be interesting, might be important. So if you think about that, we really haven't paid much attention to the needs of the data scientist from a governance perspective, because boy, that's a lot of work to actually start to think through something you're not even really sure is going to be relevant, right? So let's introduce our data steward. I've made my data steward, I call her Barbara. She looks like a librarian, and in many respects, that's what data stewardship really is, right? And I would argue that for the past 10 years, Barbara has spent all of her time down here with classic left to right thinking. Right to left thinking. This is what the data means. This is how I can provide certainty around what it means. This is how I can make sure that all of my executives don't go to jail. And what I would advise all of you today is Barbara's job needs to start to move closer up to the top of the funnel. She needs to provide just the same amount of security for the data scientist that she would for the end user. So think about this for a second. Let's say that I'm trying to do some predictive modeling on user behavior by gender, by age, by all these different sensitive types of demographic behaviors to understand how my product is working in the marketplace. It's quite possible that Mr. Data Scientist here is not authorized to have that information. How did you control that? So I'll give you an example from my TD days. There was a lot of interest in terms of where people lived and how it correlated to their interest in certain kinds of accounts in mortgage origination. So we said, great, what kind of information do you need? They said, well, we'll need their name, their address, their postal code, and their telephone numbers. And I said, well, if you're really interested in geography, isn't just the postal code and an identifier good enough for what you're looking to do? In fact, isn't only the first 3 digits of their postal code good enough? And the answer is, of course, that's right. As we start to understand the use cases that are there, we need to be able to control the data. Now, but what if you never actually bothered to understand what that data was? What was in your catalog for use? Now you're cooked. So now all of a sudden we need to start to think about what are the principles of governance that are going to affect the top of the funnel in the same way that they're going to affect the bottom part of the funnel. And here's where the real fun begins. So what I would like to do is, before I move on to some of the data geekery, because that's what we're all good for here, I'd like to compare this to a little bit of a different kind of metaphor for how we see this and experience this in our everyday life. Let's think about the fact that we are going home and our spouse says to us, we need a shed. We need to buy a shed. We have no space, and the bicycles and the lawn is a mess, and we need to buy a shed. Now, there's some of you out there that would look at a hammer and a nail and say, that's really not for me. I would really prefer to go and buy that shed. Thank you very much. And so for those people, you would go to the store and you would ask questions like, is this safe? Is it durable? Who made it? This is a finished good. This is the bottom of the funnel. This is the end products. And the questions that you're asking are right to left questions. You want to know the provenance of this shed. You want to know the shed maker's track record for these sheds because you yourself are not building this shed. Now, let's say that you were somewhat handy with a little hammer and nails, and you might say, you know, what I'm really interested in doing is I want to go to the store and I want to buy the raw materials for the assembly of this shed. I ask you, are those really raw materials? No, of course not. They've been carefully put on the shelves, and what you care about are what are the dimensions of this material? Is it 2 by 4 by 12? What material is it? Maybe it makes a difference if it's ash or pine. Is it pressure treated? Now all of a sudden what these are metadata tags about the data itself. So think about this semi-finished good being put on the shelf as being in this kind of available and standard definition that would be of use for somebody who has access and wherewithal to data. Now, what would happen if you were a real hardcore lumberjack? You might say, you know what, you just give me the trees. What I care about, and maybe people do this as they cut down their Christmas trees, right? You care where you're going to go for that tree. You know where it's going to cut down. You want to know where the source of that wood is coming from. And this is the only way that you can prove to yourself that you are, in fact, building a world-class shed. And then if you take it to the most extreme example, you would actually go find the forest, right? And so the reason I show you this example is that each of us that's listening to this call might find themselves in a different quadrant about what they were looking when they hear their spouse say, we need a shed. Some of us here just go buy a shed. Some of us here, that's a trip to Lowe's coming right up. And some of us here, an opportunity for craftsmanship that can be created with the finest wood that can be produced by the finest forests available, right? So the reason this becomes important is you could see the questions that you were asking were different depending on what it is. The bottom is really about where did this come from? And as you get closer to the top, it's what can I make of this? So this becomes a really important kind of principle about what we care and how we think about the concept of tagging data as we go through. And so where you shop really will depend on your skills. Data scientists shop here, data analysts shop here, and data executives shop here. And hopefully that metaphor holds together for you. So as we start to keep moving on, there are some things that we need to start to think through that are different from a governance perspective that are not about classic data quality, data lineage, and custody types of questions. So now all of a sudden we need to start to think about, now how do I protect data by term? As opposed to thinking about, here is a data set, it contains sensitive information about HR, therefore I will restrict it from these parts of the organization. You now need to start to think about the connection of terms in the abstract, the security policy around those respective terms, and then how it's going to be applied when you actually see them. So for instance, you may make a policy decision that says someone's health information is restricted. You should if you work in healthcare. That's not dependent on where that comes from. It doesn't matter if it came from a third-party source or if it came from an internal source. It matters that it's a term. So you now just start to think about the term, and then you need to start to think about the metadata associated with a glossary of that. So now I have a thing called blood type. Blood type will have a certain kind of characteristic. I need to start to move from the policy to the actual definition and start to define that. And then I need to be able to start to discover and map that data from the glossary to apply the policy. So blood type has a certain kind of a policy. I don't really want to share that. That's HIPAA protected. So now all of a sudden I import a new data source that comes from my healthcare system or my insurance provider. And what I need to be able to do is to recognize what that term is as I see it and apply the degree of security to it. So let's talk a little bit about, there are new technologies that are kind of coming out here that use AI principles to do this. And you really have a handful of different things that you can do. You can look for a pattern. So for instance, telephone numbers, tax IDs, they have a certain pattern that's recognizable. Number two, you can look for a list of values. So country codes, blood types, state codes. They happen to live within a certain limited value. There's no one that's ever had a D positive blood type. So you can look through the list of values and identify it. And sometimes there are things that are about associations and proximities. So if you saw something that was a month/year, you might not know exactly what that was. But what if it was right adjacent to a credit card number? You might understand that that was in fact an expiration date for that credit card. So now that you have this idea of the ability to onboard data, recognize what it is, and apply the policy in context. And what I mean by policy, to be explicit, is A, can a person have this or not? B, if they were to have it, are there certain restrictions that should apply with respect to row counts? You can only see things within a certain geography, for instance, or with respect to policy on obfuscations or encryption, or etc. So if I have those things in place, now what I can start to think about is this idea of a self-service data catalog that can provision that. At the end of the day, the catalog will only be as good as the metadata supporting it. So our ability to create and broadcast this policy with a shopping experience, more like a marketplace than it is a classic kind of glossary or catalog for no purpose, will be super powerful. So I want you to think for a moment about the catalog that exists on Amazon.com. You probably haven't thought about it. You haven't thought about it because it's only viewed as supporting infrastructure for the transaction that you're about to do. We want data to be the same, right? People need data. They should be able to shop for it, look for it, get their hands on it in a meaningful way, search by metadata tags, have restriction and security that's imposed by policy, and then workflow that's put in place that'll help you with the stuff that you don't know what it is, right? So I've never seen this kind of a field. Well, what does it mean? Well, I've seen that field, and that comes back to a project that I had a long time ago. And for instance, on this example, years ago, back in the early 90s, I was working on an SAP project, and it was before SAP was even a client server. They called it R2. It was a mainframe server. And as you can imagine, in mainframe systems, space was always at a premium. And I was asked to do a report that would tell me what was the status of material creation. And so there are 8 statuses, and was 1 done, was 2 done, all these different things. And I could not for the life of me find these status fields. And finally, after a few days of searching, I found this 2-digit hexadecimal field. And if I converted the hexadecimal into binary, I would get ones and zeros that would correlate the ons and off switches to those as ones and zeros, and voila, there it was. Now, that's not something that you're going to know right off from some AI learning. What you're going to need to do is to crowdsource that. You're going to want to understand how that data is being used. And so that's kind of what we want to start to think about. So this is in my estimation, what the future of offensive governance looks like. Descriptive, the ability to ascertain what data is, the ability to connect it to glossary-based policy, the ability to put that in a self-service catalog, and the ability to provision that in a sensitive kind of way, a meaningful kind of way to people for their use, with a feedback loop to figure out what it means. And these are things that I think are now starting to appear. And for your benefit, I think they have to fit within the context of something like this as a data ops process. So we have to have the ability to have this failing fast discovery process. People who are doing this just want loose-based data. Give me raw stuff, help me find stuff, help me fail fast. And as we get to the end of a process where we don't fail, we actually succeed, we want to kick off an operationalization process that includes much more rich data quality rules, much more aggressive pursuit of the tags and business logic so that people can find it a second time. And then we want to also measure those results. So the principles here, the process that wraps this, is just as important as the metadata. And I started off by saying, you know, the expectations of the CDO are to enable analytics. So think about this context. This is what we do at Qlik. We want to kick off meaningful things that are related to driving the needle on key business initiatives. I'm going to go help discover what our businesses are thinking about, what the telemetry is in our SaaS product, what our renewal rates are by geography, by product line, by time frame. And what we'll find is that these things, maybe some things might be important. The telemetry might be important. This third-party data source might be important. But gosh darn it, if it is, let's operationalize that. Let's make sure that we put that productively in a catalog. Let's ensure that we make these operationally rich data ops pipelines that refresh that data against an SLA. And then let's make sure that we're measuring against those results, right? So the process is equally as important as the governance principles that we're kind of embracing here. And then the last thing that I highlighted this area. This is kind of where the operationalization and the governance really starts to kick in full swing. And if this wouldn't be a sponsored session without a commercial for the Qlik product line. And so what I wanted to do is to highlight, many of you might think about Qlik as an analytics only product. We have a heritage for 30 years of trying to create visualizations that represent data and analytics. What I'd like to highlight for you is that we have now a very robust data integration business that is really anchored around a lot of the principles that we're talking about. Data exists in the wild. It just exists. It's in the raw. It's in transactional systems. Some of you have hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of applications. What you're looking to do is to replicate those. What we're starting to see more and more is that that replication is happening into cloud-based systems like Snowflake. So this is the Qlik reference architecture, and we are taking these data integration. We do replication in a near real-time basis and put that off into a lake. What we want to see is as that lands, we want to make sure that there's a catalog. So Qlik offers a catalog that helps to inventory the contents of that lake so that they can be made available on demand for whatever kind of analytics and application that you'd like to build. So if you haven't seen the data integration stack from Qlik, it's based on a couple of acquisitions. The acquisitions were Attunity and Podium that happened last year and the year before, and they are now starting to form a much broader integrated suite of the Qlik portfolio. And I promise that's the end of my Qlik commercial. So as I wrap this up, we need to think about data governance to be left to right if it's related to AI. We can't wait for the curation of data. AI is fundamentally about the consumption of the raw. And if you're interested in ethical AI, if you're interested in making sure that the right data is being provisioned to these models, you need to start to understand what the raw data is in order to make it available. If you discovered that you wanted to make lending decisions and your AI told you that older women of color have, that's too late. Those are in addition to being unethical dimensions, they are illegal patterns, right? You need to make sure that you have these different and complementary data governance capabilities. So I'm not here to say that you shouldn't play defense anymore. On the contrary, we need to be at all times the last barrier of defense to keep our executives out of jail, to make sure that we can meet compliance needs. And what we need to start to do is to embrace a wider array of these things and embrace processes that help create those outcomes a little bit more cleanly and easily. And then we need to start to think about this development process being an accelerator as opposed to overhead. Today, I think that the construction of data warehouses has led people to think that it's a big, clunky IT projects. And if you embrace the concept of data ops within this overall construct of governance, people will view that governance as something that helps them find the data that they want. No one walks into a library and accuses the librarian of censorship or accusing the librarian of restricting books. And yet that's what we do with our governance principles all the time. We want to be equally in the business of enabling people with data as protecting the assets themselves. So with that, that's the end of my conclusion. I'd love to stay connected. I have a blog at qlik.com. I'm on LinkedIn. So I invite you to stay connected with me, and you can see just how coronavirus has affected my hair. This is pre-coronavirus and this is post. So just to give you a sense of what I used to look like. So I've left a few minutes here if there are any questions on the talk.
So we had one. It references the importance of cataloging and good data profiling. Would you like to speak about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, the catalog is going to be the backbone of how people consume data. So a lot of the work we do is invisible. I always think about, governance is in some respects a thankless job. It's when we turn the faucets on in the morning, we just expect the water to come out. We don't write a letter of thanks to the treatment plants or the water system, right? And governance is in many respects a thankless job in the same way. The catalog for me is a way to change some of that. If you can convey to your business stakeholders where their data is, provide them a roadmap to get access to the things that they need. And if the data is restricted, to find the policies that restrict them and the people that can actually help them work around those processes. That really is the backbone of how to guide someone to find that which they need. And I think that, the public relations kind of, it gets significantly increased if we can create these self-service experiences that are really engineered around a catalog. And I really do kind of embrace the session that was before me was our elation counterparts, and they're very big proponents of some of the crowdsourcing notions as well. I think the ability to get it out into the masses and not pretend that you know everything, but to really embrace this concept of analytic communities who improve the overall value of the assets of your data. And that's what helps it get used. If it's not in the catalog, it's not going to get used. If it takes me 5 days to find the data that I need, I'm just going to skip that process altogether. And the last point I would say is the thing you want to know is also, is it any good? So people are going to crave, once they see it in the catalog, this is, say, data set A, this is data set B, this is my gold standard, this is my silver, this one is user beware, I haven't even looked at it. So really creating an understanding of what data is available to you is really essential for unleashing analytics value.
Excellent. And the next question we have, and we only have about 4 minutes left, how do you collect metadata from scratch? Where do you start and where do you document it?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that happens when we started this process at TD, we very much kind of embraced here's a data set, how do we go set by set? It was overwhelming. And this idea of harvesting from scratch really was a little bit more than we could handle. And so what we started to do was to focus principally on what could we know based on the policies that we cared about. So what data do we care about? And then how do we find it in the data? And that's where this rules-based approach really comes into consideration. I would really carefully consider tools, and Qlik is one of them, that can help you apply rules to harvest the metadata in your data. There are tools that will help specifically that I think are more, longer in the tooth, specifically in the unstructured world. But there are lots of tools in the structured world that will help you based on semantics, help you identify what your data means. And what you'll need is to create the governance culture that starts to recognize it, catch those balls, and put them into categories. Now that I know that I have a hair color, what is my proper treatment of that? And working with the data architecture team to really make sure that you have a logical architecture, a logical model that helps you understand how it all fits together.
Thank you. And 2 more questions. I think we can probably fit both of them in. Can you give us some examples of how integration of Snowflake with Qlik creates value?
Sure. So, at the end of the day, we're all looking for ways to, there's different problems that you have. We've been talking here about a process and governance problem. There's also an analytics problem. And then there is the good old fashioned, how do you store data at volume problem? If we were having this talk 3 years ago, I would have said the word Hadoop probably 5 times, right? It was our way for how we were going to store data at volume to allow us to actually do the inspection. We were saying, how do we harvest metadata? Well, you get it to a place where you can do that harvesting. Now, what we're starting to see is a real significant change to cloud-based architectures as the costing model changes, right? Storage is less expensive. I don't want to have a data center. And so the idea is if you can combine replication technology with the way to cheaply and effectively store and manage that data with the ability to analyze that data, you now have a really compelling end-to-end string. I can get the data I need, I can store the data I need, I can govern the data I need, and now I can analyze the data I need. And you need all 4 of those components.
Okay, we're going to sneak in this final question. Who said in analytic chaff is the new wheat? Can you say a little more about it?
So I just actually responded to Elizabeth online. His name was Dave Reiner. I worked with him at EMC. And the idea is that, there's lots of things that we inherently know are important in our business because we know a regulator is going to ask us. We know the COO is going to ask us and hold us accountable for these KPIs. And I would argue that that's not how breakthrough ideas happen. If you kind of think about, I mentioned that Target story about how Target is able to predict the pregnancy. One of the first behavioral patterns in women in terms of their shopping behavior is a shift from scented lotions to unscented lotions. And you don't know that unless you have an experiment. You look for it. It's the unexpected, kind of the things that you might not have even looked at before are actually hugely important and worth millions of dollars, which means that you can't just, we used to throw all the data away and focus on 100 critical data elements, right? Here's 10,000 columns. Don't worry about that. Just worry about 100. Well, you're not going to get anywhere. Everyone's already looking at those 100. What you need to do is to spend your time in the places that people aren't looking, and to create governance processes and data ops processes that really promote this idea of experimentation and failing fast. So people, I think, talk about that a lot in an analytics context, but don't talk about it enough in a governance context. And I think those need to work hand in hand.
Excellent. Great coverage. I thought it was a nice balance of actual practitioner relevant content and just a little bit about tools and technologies that you're very familiar with. And but Joe, incredible session. And everybody who's on still tonight, appreciate you staying till the bitter end. You know what we do with bitters? We put it in a cocktail later tonight.
Indeed.
But absolutely, I just want to say for those that are left, we have extraordinary attendance numbers for the overall attendance as well as each session. We have rough data, raw data coming in, and we're going to try to crunch it and get a little more precise for everybody so they understand a little bit about their session attendance. So with no further ado, we'll say good evening and see you all bright and early tomorrow morning.